Good evening. I'm Elizabeth Ivory, Chair of NLC, and I'm happy to welcome you to another event in our series, Alberta Rebranded. We have subheaded this series East Meet West, and tonight we have a number of audience members joining us from the MDT time zone. To them, a special welcome. Before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the oil industry was threatened by plans to address climate change. Today, global supply is the issue. For the 150,000 Albertans whose livelihoods depend on big oil, ups and downs are a way of life. Not surprisingly, oil defines Alberta's politics and influences its culture. In creating tonight's panel, our program committee looked at more than a dozen individuals, from politicians to oil industry executives and industry pundits, to strike a balance of views that reflect a breadth of opinion. They chose Dave Collyer, a former president of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, who has spent his career in the Canadian energy sector. Danielle Smith, currently president of Alberta Energy Enterprise Group, who was leader of the Wildrose Party and a member of provincial parliament. And Max Fawcett, a journalist who is the National Observer's lead columnist and has experience also in climate change policy. Our moderator is Markam Hislop, principal of Energi Media, who spends his days promoting thoughtful journalism about Canadian energy's future. We're delighted to have panelists of such high caliber for this second event in the Alberta series, taking place the day after Canada's Climate Action Plan was announced by the federal government. Before I hand things over to Markham, please remember to submit your questions through the Q&A function of Zoom. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible tonight. So without further ado, over to you, Markham.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. I also want to thank NLC and Dorothy Gale for organizing this event and for asking the panelists to participate and asking me to moderate. Really appreciate that. We're going to begin with a 5-minute frame setting from each one of the panelists. And I'm going to begin as moderator because most of the work that I do in journalism is around the energy transition, the global energy transition. And essentially this one is moving off fossil fuels, so coal, oil, and natural gas, to clean electricity and to low carbon fuels like hydrogen. We've had energy transitions in the past, and the last one, particularly the last one, sort of sets the pattern for this one. So the last one was when the internal combustion engine and cheap petroleum replaced the animal power and steam, started in the mid 1890s. And by first of all, it was very slow because these are new technologies, and when they enter the marketplace, they're not very competitive with the old technologies. It takes them a long time to develop and get, and each iteration gets a little better and a little more reliable and a little more economic. So by 2020, all of the new technologies like cars and trucks and tractors and so on were now competitive and began pushing out the old technology. And so you have the 1920s was essentially the disruptive decade when growth became exponential, and basically you got the hockey stick curve in the adoption of these new technologies. And then after 1930, well, of course, you have the Depression, then you have the Second World War, and by the late 1940s, for instance, you couldn't find a horse on a farm in Alberta, and nobody was riding them either. So essentially, the internal combustion engine was now dominating the market. Well, the same thing is happening now. If you look at the technologies that are for this energy transition, which are things like wind and solar, lithium ion batteries, and the electric vehicle, and a host of other technologies like artificial intelligence that are enabling technologies, they got started in the 1990s. And so we've had roughly 25 or 30 years of these technologies developing, getting better and better. If you saw the cost curves, particularly for wind and solar, about 2008, 2009, they start to plunge. And now wind and solar are the cheapest way to generate electricity. if you're looking at an electric car, it's the lowest cost per kilometer driven, on and on and on. So my point here is that the 2020s are the disruptive decade of this energy transition. And we're just seeing it now. I mean, you look at the changes that are taking place in the global auto industry. The auto industry cannot get off gasoline and diesel fast enough. Last year alone, globally, the industry spent $270 billion on clean transportation, cars, trucks, buses, semi-tractors, all switching to electric. That's the future of transportation, and that spells bad news for Alberta oil. And so my guess is, and in fact, there's consultancies like Wood Mackenzie who say that the 2020s will be the last great oil boom of not only Alberta, but globally. And what they recommend that oil companies do is that they invest they're going to earn very solid profits, and they should invest them in strengthening their balance sheet and investing in pivoting to low carbon business models. And so after 2030, as uncertain as the things are going to be in the 2020s, after 2030 and beyond, it gets even more and more uncertain. I've interviewed International Energy Agency oil analysts, and they think that peak oil demand is coming around 2032, and then we'll see how steeply it declines. But this is the environment in which Alberta finds itself. And I want to place, and I apologize ahead of time to the panelists, but I want to place each one of them in where I think they would fit on their approach to the energy transition. Now, Max and I have had long conversations, and I know where he stands on it. And I think he would agree with me that the energy transition is accelerating rapidly, and it's coming a whole lot faster than Albertans understand. Dave is probably somewhere in the middle. He's been working on climate change issues for 20 years, back when he was with Shell and then with CAP. And I know that he understands that things are changing. Danielle, I would probably put a little bit to the right of Dave, and maybe she thinks it's coming slower. And I think if you keep that frame in mind tonight, that will explain a lot of our positions on these various issues. Now, I'm finished my 5 minutes. I would then now like to turn it over to Danielle. And Danielle, if you can give us your 5-minute framing of energy in Alberta.
You got it. Thanks so much, Markham. I think one of the things I should mention coming to the issue is that I come to it from an environmental perspective. The very first paper I did was on environmental indicators for Canada and the United States, looking at all of the incredible progress that we have made in reducing pollutants and cleaning up the environment, reducing effluent in water since 1970. And it's such a remarkable story. Then when I came to Alberta, I met a group of ranchers who care so deeply about landscapes, and they're always concerned about when you disrupt landscapes with the extractive resources. So I always wanted to approach this issue was, how do we find a way to make sure that we develop our resources in a way that has the least impact on the environment? And if it does have disruptive land use, that we return it back to its natural condition as quickly as we can. I don't use the word transition when we're talking about our energy sector. I use the word transformation because unlike Markham, I think that we're going to see oil and natural gas be used in the future pretty well forever. And I'll explain why I think that's the case, because what we need to talk about is how we're going to use oil and natural gas in a different form for other uses. We want to stop or reduce the amount of combustion. But already petrochemicals have 6,000 different products that are made from oil and natural gas. To me now, looking at all of the different opportunities to capture CO2 and make this a circular economy type of discussion about how we use our resources, it would be as silly to talk about getting rid of natural gas and oil as it would be to talk about phasing out concrete or phasing out steel. Because one of the things I've noticed over the last number of years is that the energy industry has gotten very, very good at figuring out ways that they can take this waste stream and turn it into useful products. In the past, what we had done with carbon technology is we captured the CO2 and then we pumped it underground and used it to produce more oil and gas. And that was or oil in particular. It was a problem for the environmental community because they're thinking, well, wait a minute, is that actually in the end capturing CO2? But what we're seeing now is that we have an incredible amount of pore space in Alberta that has immense capability to be able to capture CO2, and on a decentralized scale as well. We already know that the 5 super majors are on a pathways project to be net zero by 2050. I'm 100% confident that they're going to get there. But there are smaller projects too. I found one project in southern Alberta. It's a deep gas well site that has the capacity to sequester 40 megatons of CO2. And if you use compression, because there's a compressor at the site, it can capture 80 megatons. There's another site that's in the Leduc field where they believe that they can capture the CO2, hive off the hydrogen so that it can be used as a transportation fuel and then create a transportation hub for hydrogen with heavy vehicles going between Calgary and Edmonton. And these are really exciting projects. So those are a couple of ways in which I see this transformation occurring, but there's even more. If you look at, for instance, even if we did all move to electric vehicles, we're going to need something to drive on. And asphalt is and concrete are two of the main ways in which we create roads. Where do you get asphalt from? Well, from bitumen. So if we end up having a larger share of our bitumen that is harvested without burning fuel, for instance, if you could get small modular nuclear reactors to get the fines out, and then you're not combusting it at the end, you're using it for asphalt, that's going to have a huge impact on reducing overall CO2 emissions. There are companies in Alberta as well that are experimenting with using bitumen to turn it into carbon nanofiber. And what can carbon nanofiber do? Remarkable things. It's a building material that may turn out to be more robust and strong and durable than steel. So you can, and lightweight as well. So you can imagine a future where we might be creating hydrogen powered vehicles made from carbon nanofiber components so that we can capture permanently all of the CO2 into a vehicle. Then there's more. There are companies that, from a carbon X prize that was developed a few years ago, carbon upcycling being one of them, they found a way to capture the CO2 and embed it in cement so that you can make a more durable concrete. There's a company in Calgary that has a membrane that they can put on industrial furnaces so that they can capture the CO2 and turn it into industrial minerals that can become soap. There's a really interesting company that can take the CO2, turn it into a pure stream of alcohol, and they market it under a vodka brand called Airco. So when I look at all of this innovation—
Danielle, you'll have to wrap it up.
Sure. When I look at all of this innovation, and one more I would just add, Elon Musk has gotten into the game with a new $100 million X prize for direct air capture. I don't think that we should be talking about transitioning out of oil and natural gas. I think we should be talking about all the ways in which we are transforming its uses. And I think that it has a great future for a long time to come.
Thank you, Danielle. Now I'm going to call on Dave Collyer, please.
Thanks very much, Markham, and thanks to NLC for the opportunity to participate in what I think is a very timely session. I was asked to try and frame the views of Albertans regarding the energy transition and climate change, which I will try and do. I would say first, no one should be surprised to hear that there is not a monolithic view among Albertans as to their perspective on these issues. I would say the full range of views exists in Alberta that exists in any other jurisdiction, from climate denial at one end of the spectrum to the imperative to address climate change with great urgency and with little consideration for cost at the other end of the spectrum. That being said, I believe most Albertans would agree with many other Canadians in several respects as they relate to climate change and energy transition. Let me just highlight a few of the points where I think there is some commonality of views. That climate change is a real issue, it needs to be addressed. I don't think there's a whole lot of debate about the outcome we're trying to achieve at the end of the day. Energy systems are going to change. We are going, and I use the word transition, but I use the word transition in the context of transitioning to a lower carbon economy, which doesn't necessarily, to Danielle's point, mean transitioning away completely from oil and gas. Diversification of our economy over time is an imperative. I think there would be agreement that investment in technology and innovation is key, both to reducing GHG emissions and creating new competitive advantage through focus on diversification of products. And finally, that a climate and energy policy framework in Canada needs to be developed that reflects both Canada's circumstance and how Canada fits in a global context. So having said all that, I would also say that in Alberta, there's a very well-developed understanding of energy systems. And I think a degree of pragmatism and realism with respect to how quickly the energy transition can occur and the nature of that transition over time. And particularly in the context of what I think are some rather lofty expectations and very aspirational expectations that the Canadian government has with respect to the pace at which this can occur. And I think that's at the heart, frankly, of many of the differences between Alberta and Ottawa on this file. And I just thought I'd just touch on a few of the key areas where I believe there's some rub points and important rub points. I think Albertans would say there's often far too much singular focus on greenhouse gas policy at the expense of consideration of economic prosperity, economic competitiveness, energy security and reliability. And I think we're seeing, in light of the war in the Ukraine, some of the implications of not paying enough attention to some of those other important areas. I think Albertans would agree that we need to diversify our economy, but I think they'd say we should build on the economy we've got in terms of diversifying, as opposed to vilifying that economy in the interests of a very aggressive transition to lower carbon. We need to continue to ride the horse we're on while we develop another horse to ride. Albertans, I think, would say there's no certainty as to how the transition of global energy systems will occur. There are certainly credible scenarios that say we're going to be using that for a bit of oil and gas for quite a long time to come, and that Canada can be an important contributor to global supply and a very responsible contributor to global supply and contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions through things like LNG exports. And it begs the question of why Canada seems to want to forgo that opportunity when other countries don't really show any compulsion to do so. I think Albertans would say that barriers to Canada's competitiveness in global oil and gas markets are being exacerbated rather than mitigated. Examples of that are a layering on of policy and regulation around carbon, a pretty ineffective regulatory system for approval of new projects. And that applies across the board. That's just not an oil and gas issue. And I think a failure of leadership by governments on the Indigenous file. And finally, I think Albertans would say there is not adequate support from the current federal government in terms of achieving the very aspirational GHG reduction targets that have been established, and that's not commensurate with the contribution that Alberta has made and the industry has made to the health of the rest of the country over many years. So just to sum up, Markham, I would say there are many areas of common ground on which we can build. The divide is not as large as it often is represented to be, but there's also some stark differences, I think, in the way we view these issues. And I think you have to put that also in the context of some fairly significant divides in the Federation and to a certain degree, a feeling of alienation among many Albertans at this point in time. So I'll leave it at that. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dave. And Max, if you can now take your 5 minutes and frame the question or the issue, please.
Well, thank you, Markham. Thank you, Dave and Danielle, and thank you to the NLC for having me here today. I find myself in the position of agreeing with almost everything that the other two panelists have said so far. So I'll try to spice things up a little bit here with my comments. I appreciate Markham sort of putting me on the left side of the spectrum here. And I think, in Alberta, that tends to be the position that I occupy. I work for the NDP government's climate change office. I push hard on the industry at times when I think they're doing things incorrectly. But I'm from Vancouver and I grew up in Toronto partially. And when I'm out there, they treat me like I'm an oil and gas industry apologist. So, it really just depends on where you are, how your perspective lands. So, I'm not quite as left-wing, I think, as maybe I was portrayed here. I was asked to sort of present the oil and gas industry's perspective here. And I don't really think I'm qualified to do that. And I'm pretty sure they don't want me to be doing it for them either. So what I'll do instead is I'll tell you how I see their current predicament and what it means for the rest of the country. And for years now, especially out here in Alberta, the industry has been reading from a playbook that a guy named Ezra Levant wrote for them back in 2010 called Ethical Oil. The basic premise is simple and seductive, that our oil comes from a place where we have democratic institutions, we treat people kindly, we uphold the rule of law, and we have good regulatory frameworks. And countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia do not have any of those things. Therefore, our petroleum products should command a place of privilege on the global market. And there's some truth to that. Like any sort of compelling argument, Canada does uphold the rule of law and treats individuals fairly in a way that those regimes definitely don't. But that has nothing to do with the oil and gas industry. And they don't get credit for the work that people like Pierre Trudeau and Jean Chrétien did in implementing the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, for example. That's especially true when the oil and gas industry has spent decades building a narrative about how Pierre Trudeau was this evil, conspiratorial sort of person who tried to bring them down and deprive them of their fortunes. They don't get credit for the work that he did. And on the environmental side, I mean, yes, we have good regulations here, certainly better than a lot of the regimes that are major oil producers. But again, the oil and gas industry has pushed back against those regulations for as long as I've been alive. They have not been welcoming regulation, they have been resisting regulation. They talk about per barrel emissions being down 20-30% from where they were a decade ago. When I was with the Alberta government, we would send officials to New York and California and London to sort of try to make the case for Alberta oil, and we would send them with this information. And it's true, the emissions have come down. They've brought in some very interesting technologies, but they've come down from a very high level. It's sort of damning with faint praise sometimes. The best oil sands facilities right now can produce a barrel of oil with the same greenhouse gas emissions as the average refined barrel in the United States. That's only the best ones. The worst have much higher emissions. And yet, a day doesn't go by where I don't hear someone from the industry saying that Canada has the best environmental record in the world, or that we're an undisputed leader in ESG metrics. The War Room, which is paid for with taxpayer dollars here in Alberta, they've run ads in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal saying that very thing. But look, I'm here to dispute it. We are not the best in the world. We are good. We are getting better, and that would be a convincing message. But to say that we're the best is not accurate. Norway, I'll give you an example, is another major oil producing country, not as much as us, but they just brought a product online that produces oil with less than 1 kilogram of carbon dioxide per barrel. We can't get it under 30 in Canada. So we have a long way to go. None of this is to suggest that we shouldn't be exporting Canadian oil. I've always supported pipeline projects because I think for as long as the world is using oil and natural gas, it should be using as much Canadian natural gas and oil as possible. But the industry hasn't held its end of the bargain up here. They haven't reduced emissions as much as they said they would. There's certainly, Danielle says that she has utmost confidence that they'll get to net zero by 2050. I do not. And their reaction to the federal plan, I think, is proof of that. It's time to put up or shut up, as I said in the column the other day. That means no more ragging the puck, no more stalling for time, no more excuses about we can't do it fast enough. If oil prices stay where they are right now, they could actually afford to pay for the entire $75 billion transition in 1 year. They're not going to do that, but the point is that they could afford it. They don't need a federal, massive federal investments the way they say they do. So I'll wrap up here. If the industry is as ethical as it likes to say it is, it needs to start behaving a little more ethically. And that, I think, is where the rubber meets the road right now.
Thank you, Max. We're going to go to questions now, and I've got a number of them for the panelists. Each panelist is going to be given 2 minutes to respond, and then I'll maybe say a minute or so of my own comments. So the first question is, 2 days ago, the federal government released its emission reduction plan that called for a 42% reduction in Canadian oil and gas emissions by 2030. Is this reasonable, and is it achievable? And I'm going to call on Dave Collyer, who is a oil and gas engineer and a former head of Shell Canada. So Dave, give us your take.
Yeah, thanks, Markham. My reaction to the federal plan is 2 or 3 things. One is I don't think it's a plan. It's a restatement of sectoral objectives. It does not have much in the way of specifics regarding how it's going to be achieved. If I was in business and brought forward a plan that looked like that document that the federal government put forward, I think I'd be sent down the road pretty quick. So it, like many other federal plans, lacks detail, lacks specificity. It is very ambitious. I think in terms of the pace at which there is an expectation that emissions can be reduced. And I think it's important to keep in mind that there's two things that have to happen here. One is the technology has to be available. The second is the technology has to be deployed. And to be deployed, it needs to be funded. It needs regulatory approvals. It needs First Nations support, et cetera, et cetera. And we've got a tremendous track record in this country of not doing very well in any of those counts. So the practical realities, I think, of the pace at which technology can be implemented will come home to bite us in terms of the expectations around how quickly emissions can be reduced. Now, is there a significant opportunity to reduce oil and gas emissions? Absolutely. And I think Danielle touched on a number of potential opportunities to do so. I would say if we want dramatic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from oil and gas, carbon capture is the way to do it. And the issue at carbon capture is the economics of it. It will come down to a debate about who pays, and that will be a very interesting debate coming up. But the opportunity is there. I think the pace at which the federal government expects it to happen is unrealistic.
Thank you, Dave. And now I'm going to call on Max.
Yeah, I mean, I agree mostly with Dave here. I look at the plan they laid out. I think the targets are ambitious, but there's no certainty about the carbon capture tax credit that has been talked about, and that's everything. Figuring out as quickly as possible how we're going to finance these projects, getting them through those, the regulatory processes, getting the communities on board. That takes time, and we're already in March, almost April 2022. This is not something that you can just flick a switch and it happens overnight. So, I think it's important to shoot for the stars and you'll hit the moon, right? So I think it's important to have an aspirational target. I think as long as we are bending the curve in the right direction by the end of the decade, if it is pointing down, if there are projects in the pipeline, if things are happening, then I think we'll be in a good place. But we need more specifics, and we need the numbers conversation to happen a little more quickly. Hopefully with the federal budget in a week or so, that will get ironed out. My concern is that the feds don't have a partner that they can work with right now in Alberta. Jason Kenney is not going to play ball here. He is not going to work with Ottawa. And we lose precious months, days, weeks, even years with them fighting over jurisdictional issues. We're not gonna get the progress that we need to see here.
Great, thanks, Max. And Danielle, if we could have your response, please.
I do think that the energy sector can get to net zero, and that they can get to net zero faster than anyone else, but maybe not quite as fast as 2030. I just did some quick math because I've had a presentation by the Pathways Group, and their intention is to be sequestering 15 megatons a year by 2030 of their 68. So that's a 22% reduction. So that's pretty darn good. And maybe they could increase it a little bit more than that. But part of their the sticky point is, number one, they want to and need to build a carbon capture trunk line. They need to build a pipeline. Now, last time I looked, there's no pipeline project that can get approved from conception to completion in 7 years. So if we want to see some movement, maybe the federal government can say anything that is going to be a carbon capture project is going to have a fast track approval process, that you say yes, and then you work through how you meet the regulatory requirements and you do compliance after, as opposed to saying no for 10 years and a bunch of billions of investment, and then the project ends up getting waylaid. So if the federal government is serious about that, give the permitting a fast track approval process, and let's see how fast they can go. The second part of their plan, though, involves the deployment of a small modular nuclear reactors. And it's a really interesting and developing field. As I understand it, the first one is going to be deployed in Darlington in 2028. And so if there is, again, a fast track to getting that the small modular nuclears deployed, there is a potential that also can be fast-tracked to 2030. But I think that government needs to understand that they're the barriers. They're the ones getting out of the way. If they're going to make companies jump through a bunch of hoops, this cannot be done quickly. It cannot be done in 7.5 years. And so if this allows us to revitalize the regulatory approval process so that we can establish zones that get fast track approval and we can get these projects on track, I have more optimism. But if they're going to keep on putting barriers in the way, then they have to be realistic. And 2050, in my view, is realistic.
Well, I'm going to be the devil's advocate here because yesterday I interviewed Jan Gorski, who's the lead at Pembina Institute for Oil and Gas. And several weeks ago, the Pembina Institute released a study on how the oil and gas sector could cut its emissions by 103 megatons by 2030. Now, the federal plan calls for a cut of 81 megatons a year. And the reason why I think that might be achievable is because a lot of it is just doing more of what the industry is already doing. So, for instance, in the case of methane emissions, the industry, government, back when Dave was at CAP, it was 40 to 45% reduction in methane emissions. And then it was the federal government raised it, I think it was last year, to 75%. And Pembina says if you hit 88%, you can take 33 megatons of emissions out of the sector. And then there are other things like a little more carbon capture and storage by 2030. And there are 6 or 7 areas where if the industry did a little more than what it's doing now, it can reach those targets. And in this case, what I would like to see, this is a moment. This is an important moment for Canada and for the industry when it needs to step up. It's making lots of money and it's scheduled to make record profits, probably record revenue all throughout the 2020s. It has the means, it has plenty of clever engineers. And I think that if we maybe call it, that instead of a moonshot, we'll call it the emission shot. And instead of putting up barriers, we should be encouraged. As Max said, shoot for the stars and reach for the moon. Well, maybe we could get some stars as well. Anyway, my take on it. Now, I'm going to call
Markham, can I just comment very quickly on the Pembina work? Because
yes,
I have looked at it. And like many studies from environmental groups, it is wildly optimistic with respect to what can be done. There are opportunities, as I said earlier, but electrification, for example, that they assume is going to happen, it's not economic to do. So you say industry is going to step up. Well, stepping up requires that industry take on investments that are not economic to make. Now, if that's what we're talking about when we say step up, then those are the implications.
Well, Dave, one of the things I've learned, and I take your point, I have a lot of respect for your expertise and your experience. That being said, the Americans put a man on the moon in 8 or 9 years, and I think that's the approach we should take. That's my point of view. Yep. Anyway, let's go on to question two. Should Alberta oil and gas production be phased out as part of Canada's climate commitments? And these are Zipporah Berman and other environmental groups in Canada make this argument. So Max, I'm going to turn it over to you if you could respond, please.
No, that's a dumb idea. The problem is emissions. Like the greenhouse gas emissions are the problem. But we need to be very clear about that. It's not oil or natural gas. If we could produce oil and natural gas with no greenhouse gas emissions, that would be amazing because they have incredible energy density. They can power things. We can. I'm not an engineer. I'm not like Dave, any stretch of the imagination. But if we could get that kind of energy density out of a fossil fuel free or a carbon free molecule, that would be amazing for the global economy. That would be amazing for everyone. So we need to focus on what the issue is. The issue is not punishing Alberta. The issue is not punishing the oil and gas companies. The issue is not restricting the flow of oil and gas. The priority is reducing emissions. And so focus all of your policy levers on that aspect. This is why I get into arguments with people where they say, we should shut down TMX. We should not be exporting any oil and gas. Well, guess what? Like the oil and gas is still going to get consumed for the next little while. And it's just going to get produced by other places that will then take that money and do whatever they want to do with it. I'd rather us collect the profits, collect the taxes, invest into research, invest into reducing emissions, and kind of build some momentum here. It doesn't make any sense for us to cut our nose off to spite our face just because the nose is Alberta.
Thanks, Max. Danielle, if you could answer, please.
Well, one of the things I'd say is that we have to be realistic about how we produce wind and solar as well. Wind won't be net zero until concrete is net zero, and until steel is net zero, and until fiberglass is net zero, and until all the transportation to the site is net zero. One of my the companies in the group I used to represent, it was 1,500 truckloads to get a wind farm set up. So what he decided to do was get into the wind business. So now his wind business, the emission savings offset the emissions from his other 5 businesses. He's a net zero company. It's a little bit of an unconventional way to get there, but why can't we be more holistic in how we look at this? The other thing I would say is wind and solar have been able to expand because of natural gas, because they're intermittent and we don't have very good battery backup. Natural gas has been the perfect complement to wind and solar. And so they should be looking at natural gas in partnership in order to be able to enhance wind and solar expansion. And the third thing I'd say is that we talk a lot about hydrogen, and I think that's going to be the future on the natural gas side, that if we can find a way of putting a sleeve inside the pipelines, and Dave might know more about this because hydrogen is very leaky. So we'd have to figure out a way to repurpose and retool those natural gas pipelines. But why not build the natural gas pipeline network now? And then with the plan that once the hydrogen has been built out in the United States and in Canada, then we can repurpose those pipelines for hydrogen. And that helps solar and wind too, because how is solar and wind, if they are producing hydrogen, how are they going to get it to market? They're going to have to find some way to do it. So I think that there's a perfect partnership and synergy between those 3 energy sources. And I wish that we would see that partnership play out a little bit more, because they really are complementary, especially when you add in the direct air capture component that would allow us to take CO2 emissions from the air. I'll talk more about that in one of my other answers, because I'll explain to you why I'm so darned excited about that as a potential solution for us here.
Well, I, for one, am looking forward to that. Dave, your turn.
Yeah, I fundamentally disagree with it. And I don't say that on the basis that we should not be working hard, as Max and Danielle have said, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from Canadian production. But the reality is that there is a global market for oil and gas. The market is going to be served by somebody. And I think I've never understood the argument that would say that somehow Canada should exit that market and let others serve it. Because we are good at many of the things we do. We can get better, but we're good at many of the things we do. The other thing I always find interesting about this discussion of exports and net zero is that if the world is truly, Canada exports most of its oil and gas. If the world is truly on a path to net zero, the market is going to actually take care of oil and gas production from Canada in its current form, because there won't be a market for it. If it does not move toward net zero, then Canada falling on its sword in the interim isn't going to be helpful either. So I tend to take a market perspective to this and say, let's work hard on reducing our greenhouse gas emissions from production. Let's play in the market. Let's be heads up about the fact that that market may not be there forever, won't be there forever. And we need to manage our production expectations accordingly. And at the same time, we need to diversify into other products and away from selling oil and gas in its conventional form.
Before I comment, Dorothy wants me to remind everyone, if you could submit your questions for the Q&A that'll follow our panel discussion. Now, Dave, I want to follow your last sentence in your comment is a perfect lead in to how I would respond to this. Absolutely not. Canadian oil and gas should not be phased out, but it should be phased into something else. And in my opinion, the worst thing you can do with a hydrocarbon is burn it. It's not only the most harmful thing, it's the least value thing. Mm-hmm. So Alberta Innovates, which is a provincial research agency, has been working on turning bitumen into carbon fiber. They think that in literally 3 years, there's going to be a commercial process developed. And if you turn a barrel of bitumen, or at least the heavy ends, into carbon fiber, you create $217 of value out of that barrel instead of the $30 you get if you sell it as feedstock for a refinery. And if you turn natural gas into hydrogen, you get, I don't know what the numbers are there, but I've been told that it's a higher value than if you just sold the natural gas for $5 or $6 a megajoule. So why in the world are we what we should do, and I've written columns about this, so this is Energi Media's official position, folks, is that we should have a strategy beginning now, and that we, by 2040, whenever date we decide, we should be pivoting and transitioning all of Alberta's oil and gas to become, instead of being a feedstock for a refinery, it should be a feedstock for either materials or a low carbon fuel. And that would in fact set up Alberta oil and gas for a long-term future, perhaps into the next century, because we'll always need materials and we'll always need life. Yes, Max.
I mean, I agree with you. I've written pieces about the Bitumen Beyond Combustion program. It's very impressive. I think the challenge right now is scale. The future that we're describing, higher margins, higher value, is also fewer barrels, and that's tough for Alberta to wrap its head around. I mean, everything in the identity of the province since I've lived here, for almost 14 years now, is more, right? And so the idea of producing less but getting more for it it's a tough sell, and you need someone who is a good salesperson. And if our current premier had put his talents to work on that, I think he could have gotten a long way towards convincing people that this is a viable future. Instead, he's done nothing of the sort.
Well, with any luck, Danielle will become premier in the not too distant future, and this can be part of her campaign platform.
Well, I want to tell you, because I know I've had a bit of a controversial history on this issue, but one of the topics I did just before I left the air was a bit of an aha moment for me, and it was when I learned about the Haber Bosch process. And that was back in the early 1900s. We were having a difficult time getting enough nitrogen so that we had fertilizer to feed people. And so these two scientists developed a way to capture the nitrogen from the air and turn it into ammonia, which became the ability for us to expand our fertilizer supply to a point where we now have 8 billion people on the planet that we're able to feed. Now, they probably had no idea that that was what they were going to create when they created that process. But this is organic chemistry, and it's amazing. And maybe we need to have more education on what is actually possible, because the CO2 molecule is actually pretty versatile. It can be turned into a lot of really interesting things. And this is why I say, when Elon Musk decided to put $100 million into direct air capture, he tapped a young guy named Kevin Crossert, who's got a long family history in drilling. And he's now with Avatar Innovations. And he thinks that this is going to be the absolute most exciting new area of product development. And it's going to be right in Alberta. So when you put all of these things together, that if we take our traditional natural gas and we're exporting it with LNG to displace coal, that's one part of the solution. If you're using more of the barrel of bitumen to develop asphalt and other useful products, that's another part of the solution. If you're doing hydrogen and then capturing the CO2 and burying it underground, that's another part of the solution. If you're taking the CO2 and putting it into all these different useful products, that is going to be another part of the solution. So I don't even think that we need to be talking about less. I think that if we are going to be developing all of these amazing uses in the future for how we can take the carbon molecule and turn it into products, the sky's the limit. As long as we're not burning it, putting it into the air, and not finding some way of creating that circular economy to capture it and do something else with it, I don't think that we need to be talking about limitation. I think that this transformation is going to be very exciting, and that's what we should be embracing.
Thanks, Danielle.
Mark, if I just add very quickly to that, I think it's an and discussion as opposed to an or discussion. Mm-hmm. I would argue we should continue to participate in the market that's there today. That market will diminish over time, I think. All forecasts suggest that it will. We should work at reducing emissions in the near term, and we should look at diversifying and transforming the economy around oil and gas, so we've got new products to sell into a new economy going forward.
I love it when the engineer follows the journalist, right? You get a totally different perspective on the issue. Thanks, Dave. Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground here, and we're coming up. This is going to be our last question. So here it is. Can or should Alberta increase production of oil and gas to help displace Russian oil in Europe? And how might Europe's plan to accelerate its energy transition affect Alberta? So Dave, why don't you take this one?
To be honest, I think it's largely a moot point. It would be nice if we could. The ability to significantly increase production in the short term is rather modest, and we're very much constrained by infrastructure in terms of getting product to places where it could usefully serve Europe and mitigate the significant challenges that Europe is having in the near term. So you can argue that, if you look at the whole equation globally, then maybe Canada can contribute, but I think it's a rather moot point in terms of our ability to meaningfully impact the shortfall in Europe in the short term.
Okay,
Max, you're up next.
Yeah, I think Dave hit the nail on the head. It's a moot point. I hear people talking about reviving Energy East or building Keystone XL. Look, by the time those pipelines, even if you're the most optimistic person on earth, by the time those pipelines come into service, who knows what the geopolitical situation is? It's going to be 2029, 2030. We could be getting close to peak demand. Russia could have divided into 47 different constituent states. Like, we don't know what will be down the road. So I understand that the pro-pipeline people will use any opportunity to push pipelines, but it's not the answer. If you ask people at the companies building pipelines, they would say it's not the answer, that they're not interested in it. TC has basically said they're not interested in revisiting KXL at this point. It's just, we need to move on. If you have a magic wand that can go back in time to 2005 and give the industry a better strategy for winning social license, then maybe we would have the pipelines today to fill them with our oil, but we don't have that. So time to move on and pick new battles.
Danielle?
A couple of summers I went up to the Yukon. My husband was doing some cadet work in Whitehorse, and we went to the White Pass, and that was the rail line that took gold miners, St. Peter's, up to the gold fields. They built it in a year, in like the late 1800s or early 1900s. They built an entire rail system in a year. Why can't we do things anymore? Why can't we build anything anymore? I remember when I posed Ed Stelmach on this, but it did always stick with me that when we needed to build, the argument was that we needed to build new transmission lines. So he identified critical infrastructure and critical routes, and he said, we're doing it. Now we'll work out the route. The decision was made. Why don't we have governments able to work out the route, get the economic corridors built? Let's get one to on the pathway of the Northern Gateway. Let's work with Calvin Helene and the Indigenous groups that he has there to either have it at Port of Prince Rupert or north into Alaska. Let's work with our friends in Saskatchewan and Manitoba to get another route to Churchill. Let's work with our Indigenous partners to get another route to Thunder Bay. Let's work with our Inuit friends in Northwest Territories to get something to Tuktoyaktuk. Let's get the government doing the work, the hard work on the consultation, the purchase of the land, the agreements with the landowners, the environmental approvals, the partnerships with First Nations. And then we have the pathways so that when we do need to build something, we can do it. Let's get it going. So I just feel like we are so defeatist that because it takes 10 or 20 or 30, I don't know, but David can tell us what the longest approval process in Christendom was for the Mackenzie Valley pipeline. I think it was 40 or 50 years. And so this goes full circle back to where we were at the beginning, is can this all be done by 2030? Well, heck, if we can't scale up to help our friends in Europe in a way that's going to be a meaningful period of time, I think we have a real problem with our regulatory approval process. And maybe we should be looking at that. Maybe this is an opportunity to say we got to do this a different way. So I don't want to be defeatist about it. I think we should actually aspire to do something about it because it's good for our friends and allies. But if we're serious about reaching these targets, that's the kind of action that we need to have. We need to be able to say we can get this done in a year or two, not 10 or 20 years.
Max, one quick comment.
Just that this idea that if we only sped up the regulatory process, everything would be better. The Harper government tried to do that. It blew up in their face. It's why we don't have pipelines to the west. So I think we should probably not try to go back down that road again of creating a quicker regulatory process, because the courts will always kick it back.
I think Max is misunderstanding me. I think part of the problem is all of these projects have always been proponents led, and we always put the burden on TC Energy and Enbridge to do all of that work, and really all of the work of making sure that the environmental issues are taken care of and the First Nations interests are taken care of, and that we've got landowner buy-in. There's a government role in that too, and the government's been abdicating its responsibility, I'd say. So when we've been talking about economic corridors, I don't know, for 20 years. And those have to be government led in partnership with their provincial governments, but with the federal government playing a supporting role. And if we start leading with the government saying, we're going to do this, we need highways, we need new rail infrastructure, we need new transmission lines, we need to build out our broadband infrastructure. That's why it has to be government led, is because it's not just one thing. If it's proponent led, then we don't end up getting all of those additional values. So I think we've got to find a different way of doing this.
I believe I just heard Danielle Smith argue for the Trans Mountain Expansion Federal Crown Corporation developing more pipelines.
Not more pipelines.
I believe that's the pathway.
Creating the pathway. I can't wait till they sell that. There's actually a group of Indigenous leaders who want to buy that pipeline so they can be getting it into service. So I can't wait to see that happen.
On to other questions. But just before we do get on to other questions, and I want to remind the audience, if you do have questions, please submit them in the chat. We've got a couple, and we're going to get to those right away. I'm going to wrap up the discussion of this question by pointing out to Europe's response to Russian aggression. Yes, they are going to look at displacing Russian gas in the short term. I know maybe they'll get there around 2027. It's going to take them a little while to get 40% of their gas, but their primary response is to switch to electricity, renewables, and low carbon fuels. And I think that's very interesting, because what it says is that Europe thinks that clean energy technology has arrived. It's cheaper, it's better, it's more efficient, it's less emitting. And that's why they've chosen to do that, as opposed to just simply replace one hydrocarbon with another. And I think there's a lesson in there for the rest of, for Asia and for North America. And we're going to see the energy transition accelerate even further. So leave it at that. Okay, let's have a question from the audience. And I'm going to need a little technical assistance here, folks, because I can't see the questions. Does Dorothy or Elizabeth want to?
You just press the Q&A at the bottom there, Markham. Do you see it?
Got it. Thank you. Thanks, Danielle. Okay, John Gale says, didn't the Canadian Climate Plan support carbon capture? So Dave, do you want to take this?
Yes and no, I think, is the answer. Markham, it speaks to a more significant role for carbon capture. But what it didn't do is deal with, and I think Max, you referred to this earlier, it did not lay out the provisions by which that carbon capture investment would be supported from a tax credit standpoint or other means. And that may well come in the budget. So yes, conceptually support for carbon capture in the plan, but still a lot of details yet to come in terms of what exactly that looks like and whether it's sufficient to provide the incentive for companies to move forward with carbon capture on a large scale.
Danielle?
That's my understanding too. I think that they were talking about a need for a tax credit that would be able to cover $75 billion worth of the cost. And I think the number that the federal government was putting forward was significantly less than that. And I think they also needed to have a provincial partner on that. And I don't know that the provincial government has stepped up. I mean, keep in mind, Alberta's carbon emissions are 270 megatons. So to get to net zero by 2050, there's a lot of that kind of investment that's going to take place. And as I say, I wish that they would stop moving the goalposts, because we had a huge commitment I thought it was an enormous commitment that the big oil sands players made when they said they'd be net zero by 2050. I think we should be very encouraged that they want to be able to do that. So to basically say that's not good enough, we need you to get there by 2030. A lot of the work needs to be done in the last 10 years, not the first 10 years, because you've got a lot of investment and a lot of regulatory issues that have to be cleared out of the way to get to the point before you can start start putting things underground. So I think they front end loaded it, and that's where they're going to end up with trouble. And the problem is that there's such goodwill and there's such a desire to try to reach this. It's a shame that they would work more collaboratively with the industry on it.
Okay, Max, do you have any comments?
Wow, I think it's very interesting to suggest that there's a lot of goodwill on the part of the industry towards this federal government. That has not been my experience in any conversation I've had with anyone in the industry. There's the opposite of goodwill. As to the carbon capture situation, so the United States has something called a 45Q tax credit, which gives up to, I think, $45 per ton of carbon that's sequestered and not used for what's it called, enhanced oil injection processes. So I think the federal government will probably end up matching that. That combined with the existing and rising carbon tax should provide a pretty clear incentive for companies to invest in carbon capture. The environmentalists do not want any carbon capture support. So, this will be very unpopular for Trudeau and the Liberals in BC and Vancouver, in places where they actually win seats. And what are they going to do? Win one more seat in Alberta? He is sacrificing his political self-interest here to do what is best for this situation. And just to the point of, the federal government moving the goalposts, I don't think they are moving the goalposts. I think what they're asking companies to do is show that they're actually making progress towards them. If you say, well, we're going to get it all done by 2050, trust us, take us at our word, we got this, you don't need to worry. What happens if we get to 2045 and they haven't? Then we're hooped, right? Then my kid is hooped. Then future generations are hooped. So they need to see some proof that these companies have skin in the game and they're actually investing in the things that need to be invested in. So I don't have any problem with 2030 being a marker.
Okay. I'm going to point out here that the oil sands net zero by 2050 pathways initiative was the cost of decarbonizing just the oil sands was set at $75 billion. And a couple of CEOs suggested in the media that the governments should put in $50 billion of that money. And I have a problem with that because the companies certainly have the free cash flow and certainly will if throughout the 20s to fund this themselves. In addition to that, no money for carbon capture until there's commitment to not just emissions, but environmental liabilities. There are 37 oil sands tailings ponds with 1.3 trillion liters of toxic tailings in them. And it's a $31 billion conservatively a liability, and there's only 900 million of surety against that. And so if the government puts any more money into this industry, there are other collateral issues that have to be discussed on the table before a check gets cut. Don't mind the check being spent if it's a good investment, but we got other issues as well. And I think they should be linked. Dave, I'm sure, disagrees. Anyway, that's fine. We're going to go on to the next question. Are there similar transformation conversations going on in the US? Now, Dave, I want to ask you about this because you've got your ear to the ground in places like Houston in the US. What's being said down there?
There are very similar conversations going on in the US. I think the path to significant GHG reductions in the US is clearer than it is in Canada, largely because Canada's had a very clean electricity system for many years, and that has not been the case in the US. And the US has been able to achieve significant GHG emissions reductions by replacing coal with natural gas, for example. I do find it interesting that in the absence of the ability to export LNG from Canada, other than through the LNG Canada facility, which is not yet operating, many Canadian companies are looking to take advantage of the very significant increase in LNG exports from the US Gulf Coast and many, many new projects coming on stream there. So the context in which the conversation is taking place is a bit different in the US, an easier path to emissions reductions. And I think, frankly, a little bit more, maybe significantly more latitude for companies in the US to expand production and expand exports.
Danielle, why don't you go next?
The World Petroleum Congress has the path to net zero as their theme when they come to Alberta. I think it's next year that they're coming here. So I would say that gives me some indication that everybody is looking at this seriously. So maybe there's hostility between the energy industry and the Liberal government. I'll take Max at his word on that. But I think there's goodwill towards the issue. I think that there is genuinely good people that are there trying to solve the problem. And what I love that I'm seeing emerge is a group of reasonable, pragmatic environmentalists who are willing to work with industry. I've met one of them, Paul Stevers, and he came to the conclusion that this is such a significant a problem that has to be dealt with in capturing so much CO2 that the energy industry, the traditional oil and gas industry, he came to the conclusion they're the only ones who are going to be able to address that problem at scale. They're the only ones with the money as well to be able to address it at scale. And they have had the success in being able to develop these kind of massive projects. So I was pleased to meet him. I know that the Hydrogen Association head as well, he also believes that he comes from the environmental side of the spectrum, but he also believes that the energy industry is going to be the ones that solve this problem. And as for the European approach, they also acknowledge green bonds for nuclear and natural gas with carbon capture associated with it. So I think that is a recognition that as much as people love the notion of wind and solar being the only answer with battery backup or hydrogen backup, I think people are beginning to see pragmatically that we need to expand it out to include those other options. So I think that there's an emerging pragmatism where we had some polarization for a lot of years. And I think now that everybody is trying to find where's that common ground towards reaching that common goal, I think we're going to see some really miraculous things occur. And I think it may happen faster than people expect. That being said, I'd still stick with 2050 because I know how difficult it is to implement innovation and to get adoption at scale. I would say for instance, for this, I went and looked for a hybrid vehicle. And one of the hybrid vehicles that I want to get, it's a new form of Toyota that allows you to use your electricity first before the gas kicks in. It's not, I have to get on a waiting list because we don't have our allocation of cars coming here. They tend to go to Quebec and BC because they've got higher tax credits. So I wouldn't be able to get that car until 3 years from now. So if we want to be serious about helping to support consumers in buying these products, we actually have to increase the production capacity. Maybe Alberta should create a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle plant. Why does everything have to be built in Ontario? And if we're not able to get our fair share of the electric vehicle market, maybe there's a production problem there, and maybe we should be looking at solving that too. I would just also say, like, we can't also forget all the supply chain issues. We can't forget all the supply chain issues that we have. I mean, this is one of the other aspects of trying to get to this aggressive target by 2030. Until we have a more normal environment for the supply chain, it's just impossible to be able to achieve all that, even if we wanted to.
I believe I just heard Danielle Smith support Justin Trudeau's ZEV sales mandate. Well done. Max, over to you.
So I'll be quick here. I do see these conversations happening in other parts of the world. I mean, the reason why they're happening is very simple. People want to make money, and they see opportunities to make quite a bit of money with these new emerging technologies. They're, wind and solar are becoming cheaper by the day. Battery technology is getting better by the day. And there is obviously a rising price on carbon in many markets that is making traditional options more expensive. So it's really just capitalism doing its work. Big financial markets in New York and London that are pushing this forward. You have people like Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, who are sort of driving the bus here. And it's really hard to get in the way of that bus. You will get run over if you're not careful. So I'm optimistic about that aspect of it. The one thing I would say is it's interesting to me, when I talk to people in the oil and gas industry, they always have a good story to tell about their innovation and their technology. And that's great. I think it's amazing. The fact that we can get oil out of sand is a miracle. They don't assign the same credit to people in the renewable technology industry. They assume that their technologies are stuck in amber, will never improve. They can't innovate. They won't develop new technologies. And it's a little bit of a hypocrisy that kind of gets on my nerves, because if the oil and gas industry is going to innovate in these tremendous ways, guess what? So are their competitors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I often point out that the electric vehicle, battery, and wind and solar have clever engineers as well. The oil and gas doesn't have a monopoly on them, despite the fact there are a lot of Daves around. I get that. But look, I want to wrap this up by saying that I do a lot of reporting on the American electricity sector and the automotive sector. And those are two sectors that the amount of innovation that's going on and the change that's going on is absolutely phenomenal. And the pace at which the auto sector, for instance, is switching to electric is amazing. And I've interviewed utility CEOs down in places like California and the US West primarily. The pace at which they're switching over to renewables is amazing. There's a power association called Tri-State Power and Generation. It's New Mexico, Wyoming, and a couple of other states. They're going to be 70% renewables by 2030. This is and more importantly, the conversation around the energy transition and the changes that are taking place is so much more robust than it is in Canada and that it is in Alberta. They're a decade ahead of us in terms of talking about it and people wrapping their heads around the change that's coming. Anyway, that's my comment. Now I'm going to ask for some guidance from Elizabeth or Dorothy. We're past our end time. Do we have time for another question or two, or should we wrap it up?
Hi, Markham. Thanks for asking. It's really up to the panelists.
Really up to the panelists? Show of hands, who wants to continue?
I'm fine to carry on.
Okay, well, let's go to the third question. And what are the chances of filling TC Energy's empty gas pipeline from Alberta to Montreal and export the gas to Europe? And I'm going to plead ignorance here because I didn't know there was an empty pipeline. Who wants to take this one? Max or Dave? Danielle, who knows about this pipeline?
I didn't think we had an empty pipeline. Dave?
Yeah, I yield to Dave here.
Yeah, there is. This was all part of the original Energy East proposal. The problem is you need an LNG facility on the other end of it, right? And there have been various LNG facilities proposed in Eastern Canada, the latest in Quebec. And that project was just recently denied approval by, I believe, both the Quebec government and the federal government. So yes, you can get we can get more natural gas to Eastern Canada. We can't get it out of Eastern Canada to serve European markets.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, let's go on to the last question from the audience. And this one is quite apropos given Danielle's announcement today. Is it possible to take partisan politics out of the equation and work collectively to do what is necessary to reduce emissions? Danielle?
I think it is. And I would acknowledge that the NDP, at least in Alberta, also came out blasting the federal government plan as being too aggressive. So the fact that you've got the Alberta NDP being very pragmatic about this too, that says to me that there should be some kind of avenue for them to make some inroads with their federal counterpart in developing a more realistic plan. I mean, look, I think we all want to achieve the same thing. I think the criticism about the ethical oil argument was that it was too narrow. I mean, yes, we need to be concerned about energy security. Yes, we need to be concerned about energy affordability. And yes, we also need to be concerned about the environment. And if it's a conversation of and as opposed to instead of, then I think we can get there. But the fact of the matter is that I think the environmental community has been so entrenched in the keep it in the ground ambition that they're the ones who are going to have to realize that the industry is adapting, that they're trying to meet them halfway, but you can only meet halfway if the other partner's planning on coming halfway. And so if you can get a less strident positioning in the environmental community, then I think that will have an impact on the politicians. And then it shouldn't matter who gets elected or who forms a coalition, that we'd be able to meet all of those goals, and it would be good for Canada, it'd be good for the world, and be good for the environment.
Max?
Well, that's not happening. So, the environmentalists are not going to get less strident. They care deeply about this issue. They have won many battles. They are not going to stop fighting. I can promise you that. I think it's interesting that the ethical oil aficionados in Alberta, in Calgary, on the one hand, they love wrapping themselves in the Canadian flag. They love wrapping themselves in the charter and legalizing gay marriage and all these great things that we've done in this country that other regimes don't do. But then on the other hand, when you get them talking about politics, they want to separate from Canada. They hate Trudeau. They think we're too woke, and any number of other things. It is such an obvious burning hypocrisy that it stands out to people in the rest of the country. They see it. They see right through it. So, I think if we're, to cut through the partisan politics and work together to get to the bottom of this, we need conservatives in this country to knock it off and get their act together a little bit on this stuff. You do not get to simultaneously wrap yourself in the flag and try to rip it in half.
Okay, thanks, Max. Dave.
I'm an eternal optimist with respect to being able to find our way through this. I've worked hard over the years to try and bring the various parties to the table, so to speak. But I do think it requires some give and take on all parties. I think to your point, Max, the Conservatives probably need to find a way to moderate their position. But I think, I would argue the current federal government has been pretty divisive as well in their approach to a lot of these issues. And I do think there is a path through this. I think it's partly driven by technology. It's partly driven by recognition that it's an and, not an or. It's partly people accepting that this is happening around us, to your point, Markham, and may well be accelerating. So, I look at it and say, why does it have to be one or the other? Why can't we take advantage of what we have and do it better? And also at the same time, position ourselves for a future that's going to be different. And it is going to be different. And let's recognize that, acknowledge it, and figure out how to win in that game. But do it in a way that doesn't throw cold water all over what we have today. And that's my frustration, is that we seem to want to flick the switch and move from what we have to what we want to have in the future overnight. And it's not going to happen that way.
Well, I'm going to wrap this up with a little different take. My concern here is not partisan politics, it's populist politics. I've had a chance to interview Frank Graves of Ecos Research and David Coletto of Abacus Data. They've done a lot of polling and social science research into the rise of what they call authoritarian populism. It's driven by economic anxiety, both by anxious conservatives and anxious progressives, as Coletto calls it. And the problem is then that you get the kind of politics that we see in the Freedom Convoy, and those kinds, conspiracy theories and wild, irrational kinds of takes and language and narratives. And the difficulty then becomes that the Conservative Party, the People's Party of Canada in particular, which takes about 7% of the vote, but the CPC is trending in that direction because it's trying to capture those votes back. And we wind up with somebody like, you have some leadership candidates who are using language that's very populist and very disturbing. And that, I think, drives a wedge into rational discourse around these kinds of issues. And so I have no doubt that if the traditional conservatives, the Brian Mulroney conservatives, for instance, they could have sat down with Justin Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh and worked something out. It's the populism that is the wedge here. And I think that's a big threat in terms of us, Canada coming together and forming a consensus around some of these and on a moving forward. I'm on that front, I'm not very optimistic, unfortunately.
Well, let's be balanced about it, though, because the Coastal GasLink was sabotaged by extremists and $20 million of damage was caused there as well. So that's also equally alarming, that we feel that we have groups that feel emboldened to be violent like that. So I think that you can't just look at it on one side. I think that this is the issue. I mean, Extinction Rebellion, they glued themselves to buses and to streets. So that I don't think is particularly constructive. And so if we're going to try to find a space where it's constructive, I don't know that the extreme partisan rhetoric on either side is very helpful.
In my opinion, Danielle, it's a false equivalency. I think but anyway, I think we've gone quite a bit over time. Would love to discuss. No doubt you and I will have a chance to discuss this more. And Dorothy and Elizabeth, sorry.
Thanks, Markham.
Do you want to wrap this up?
I'd love to. Thank you very much, everyone. Panelists, thank you for your knowledge and your honest appraisal of the issues and your optimism in part, I think, for what Canada can do and some of the things we need to watch out for. We've got some other events coming up, including Preston Manning coming to speak to us about the roots of populist politics in a couple of weeks. So yes, lots to think about. We obviously picked the right people to debate this topic. I feel like we could let you go for another hour if you had the time, and it would be equally interesting. So thank you so much for joining NLC tonight, everyone.
Thanks everyone.
For having us.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Before our audience hangs up, just want to say next week we'll turn the dial and focus on nature. Kevin Van Tyen, a former superintendent of Banff National Parks, will be joining us. He's also an award-winning author of 14 books. He was recently involved in efforts to protect the eastern slopes of the Rockies, the water source for much of Alberta. He's also something of a bear expert. So please join us to hear Kevin speak next Thursday at 7:30 and Friday at 10 in Coburg. Before you leave, please take a minute to complete our usual survey, and thanks again for joining us tonight. Good night.